In 1974, deep underground on one of the lower levels, a massive collapse occurred. The rocks fell instantly, cutting off the workers' path to the surface. Rescue operations lasted for weeks, but the mountain reluctantly gave up its secrets. Most of the bodies were never found. Among the missing was the foreman himself, whose shift that day was supposed to be his last before retirement. Local archives dryly stated that the search was terminated due to the risk of further collapses. The entrance to the emergency tunnel was concreted over, and soon the entire mine was deemed unprofitable and closed forever. Nature slowly began to digest the industrial corpse, while the remaining residents whispered chilling tall tales to each other about the sound of pickaxes echoing from underground on moonless nights. My path to the main entrance lay through a dense, dried-up forest. The withered, barkless trees resembled bony fingers reaching toward the gray, low sky. The ground beneath my heavy boots bounced with decades of humus and pine needles. The air was still, thick, devoid of even a hint of birdsong or the rustle of small animals. The forest seemed to hold its breath, watching my advance toward the forbidden zone. The steel gates blocking the tunnel entrance had long since collapsed under the weight of time and landslides. Twisted bars stuck out of the ground like the broken ribs of a giant beast. I stepped over them, and the air temperature instantly dropped by a dozen degrees. The boundary between the outside world and the underground realm could be felt physically, like stepping from a warm room into an industrial refrigerator. I turned on my powerful headlamp, and its beam struggled to cut through the swirling suspension of coal dust and water vapor ahead. With every step deeper into the mountain, the light of the daytime world behind me turned into a dim gray, until it disappeared completely behind another bend in the tunnel. The total descent into darkness began. The mine walls, scarred by drill marks, glistened with moisture. Water dripped steadily from the ceiling through the rotting wooden supports. This sound became the only rhythm marking time in a place where time had long since stopped. Narrow-gauge rails stretched beneath my feet, partially buried under layers of dirt and stone debris. I walked along them, using this metallic spine of the mine as a guide. Artifacts of the past began to appear around me: an abandoned, half-rotted pickaxe, an overturned rusty minecart, fragments of old glass insulators. Every detail screamed of a hasty retreat, that people had fled this place in fear and panic. The deeper I went, the more my perception of space changed. The walls seemed to close in, pressing on my psyche with the colossal weight of the rock looming overhead. The air became heavy, saturated with the smells of dampness, mold, and something else, a faint, subtle scent of burnt sulfur. The flashlight picked out branching tunnels from the darkness. Huge rusty signs with half-erased lettering indicated directions. My eyes caught a lopsided sign pointing to that very walled-off level. The path there was blocked by a massive wall of concrete blocks, but right in its center gaped an uneven breach, as if smashed open from the inside. The hole was wide enough for an adult to squeeze through. My instinct for self-preservation demanded I turn back immediately to the saving light and fresh air, but my legs kept moving forward, driven by an irrational, hypnotic pull. I squeezed through the breach in the concrete. The edges of the blocks were sharp. They scratched my jacket, leaving a layer of whitish dust on the fabric. Once on the other side, I immediately felt the difference. The air here was absolutely dead. It burned my lungs with an unnatural cold. The sounds of dripping water vanished. An absolute, ringing silence set in, making my ears pop. The beam of my headlamp began to flicker strangely, losing brightness, as if an invisible force was sucking the energy from the batteries. The light trembled, snatching twisted metal beams, collapsed sections of the vault, and chunks of coal scattered on the ground out of the darkness. That was when a sound shattered the silence. It wasn't the grinding of stone or the noise of wind in the ventilation shafts. It was a clear, measured metallic thud, the scrape of steel against stone. The sound came from deep within the tunnel, from where the weakening beam of my flashlight couldn't reach. With each new strike, the vibration traveled through the ground, echoing in the soles of my boots. I froze, holding my breath. The flashlight blinked one last time and died completely, plunging me into an impenetrable, suffocating darkness. Panic dug its icy claws into my throat. At that moment, about 50 meters ahead, a dim, yellowish glow ignited in the gloom. It didn't look like the light of an electric flashlight. It was the uneven, flickering light of an old carbide lamp. The glow slowly approached. In its weak halo, a silhouette began to emerge. It was the tall, hunched figure of a man. He wore a rotted, old-style miner's uniform covered in a thick layer of black dust. A dented hard hat gleamed dimly on his head. The figure moved unnaturally, in jerks, like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. In one hand, the silhouette clutched a heavy pickaxe, the blade of which dragged along the ground, striking rare sparks. The temperature around me dropped so much that my breath turned into thick white steam, and my muscles were seized by an icy paralysis. The silhouette stopped a few steps away from me. The yellowish light fell on his face, or rather, on what was left of it. The skin, like dried parchment, was stretched tightly over the skull, having absorbed so much coal dust that it was completely black. But the most terrifying part was the eyes. There were none. In place of eye sockets gaped hollows filled with thick, swirling darkness, deep within which tiny sparks flickered like smoldering coals. On his chest, on the rotted pocket of the uniform, a metal dog tag bearing the name of the missing foreman gleamed dimly. The creature slowly raised the pickaxe. There was no aggression in this movement, only the endless, mechanical doom of a man trapped in the eternal cycle of his final shift. A hoarse, gurgling sound like crumbling rock escaped from the gaping void of its mouth. The stupor faded as suddenly as it had washed over me. Adrenaline hit my bloodstream, forcing my body to move faster than my thoughts. I turned and dashed into the pitch darkness, relying only on touch and the memory of the path I had taken. I slammed into invisible walls, scraping my skin raw, tripped over abandoned rails, fell, got up, and ran again. Behind me, through the deafening pounding of my own heart, I heard slow, heavy footsteps and the scrape of the pickaxe against stone. They didn't speed up, but it felt as though the distance between me and that sound wasn't increasing. I squeezed through the breach in the concrete wall, scraping my shoulders, and sprinted down the main tunnel. The darkness seemed like an endless, living entity trying to keep me in its depths. My lungs burned from the lack of oxygen and the acrid dust. When a faint gray patch of daylight finally appeared ahead, I lunged toward it with my last ounce of strength, like a drowning man to the surface of the water. I flew out of the mine's maw, collapsing onto the damp earth of the dead forest. The sky was still overcast with gray clouds, but this dim daylight seemed like the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. Lying on my back and greedily gulping the cold air, I stared at the black hole of the tunnel. A sepulchral chill drifted from it. There were no more sounds, only the ringing silence of an abandoned world. I forced myself to get up and walk away, never once looking back. But even now, hundreds of miles away from that cursed town, when I close my eyes, I smell rust and burnt sulfur, and the heavy strike of a pickaxe striking sparks in the absolute darkness echoes monotonously in my ears. A small town, lost among the dense forests of the northern region, had always lived in the shadow of a mountain whose depths were carved with tens of kilometers of tunnels. The local mine ceased its operations many decades ago when the vein was depleted and extraction became unprofitable. Since then, this place has turned into a monument of industrial decline, slowly being consumed by nature. The entrances to the dungeons were boarded up or blocked by stones, but time and weather took their toll, opening gaping black abysses in the slopes. This story began exactly a month ago when an ordinary Sunday walk turned into a tragedy. A local amateur photographer went into the forest looking for beautiful autumn shots. He wasn't an extreme thrill seeker or an experienced explorer of underground spaces. He was simply looking for a good angle. His car was left parked on the side of an old dirt road leading to the main mining complex. Police, volunteers, and dog handlers combed the area for a whole week. The dogs lost the scent at a rocky scree near an entrance marked on old maps as the 4th sector. Beyond that began a territory of absolute darkness and unstable rock, where rescuers descended with great reluctance and only to a shallow depth. The search was called off, the photographer was declared missing, and the town plunged into a grim, viscous expectation of the inevitable end. My involvement in this story was dictated not by heroism, but by an obsessive feeling of incompleteness. I knew the map of the mine's surroundings better than most, as I often wandered through these forests in my youth. Official search parties had examined the main entrance, but I knew of the existence of a hidden ventilation drift on the opposite slope, known among local teenagers of the past generation as the secret back entrance. The idea that the missing man could have fallen through rotten timbering in the forest and ended up in the lower tiers of the mine kept me awake. Having packed a heavy backpack with spare batteries, powerful tactical flashlights, ropes, and dry rations, I set off for the mountain on a gloomy November morning, exactly 30 days after the man's disappearance. The entrance to the hidden passage was a narrow gap between two granite boulders, densely overgrown with thorny bushes. The air around this breach was noticeably colder and smelled of damp dust, old metal, and deep, untouched earth. Squeezing through the stone vise, I found myself in a narrow concrete corridor. From that moment on, the outside world ceased to exist. The transition from the dim autumn light to absolute, all-consuming darkness was sharp and disorienting. The beam of my headlamp caught only a few meters of space ahead, resting on wooden supports covered with whitish fungus and rusty rails. The silence here was not just the absence of sound. It had its own weight, pressing on the eardrums with physical force. The only disruption to this silence was my own breathing, the rustle of my jacket, and the rare, monotonous sound of dripping water somewhere in the bowels of the mountain. I moved slowly, checking an old compass and leaving chalk marks on the walls. The tunnel sloped downwards at a slight angle. With every step, the temperature dropped and the humidity rose. The air became stale, heavy for the lungs. The dust raised by my boots sparkled in the beam of light, creating the illusion of fog. After several hours of continuous descent, I reached a crossroads marked by a half-rotted sign indicating the second level. Here the paths diverged. The central tunnel was blocked by multi-ton boulders of rock, leaving only two narrow side passages. My choice fell on the left drift, as I noticed a fresh scratch on a rusty pipe stretching along the wall. A bright mark of cleaned metal that could only have been left by a metal object like a tripod or a carabiner. Moving along the left drift required maximum concentration. The floor was strewn with sharp rock fragments and pieces of rotten wood. In some places, the tunnel narrowed so much that I had to take off my backpack and squeeze through sideways, feeling the cold breath of the mountain on my cheek. Claustrophobia rolled over me in waves. Millions of tons of stone above my head felt like a real, physical threat, ready to collapse at any moment and bury me alive. In such moments, the mind begins to play cruel games with a person. In the dancing shadows from the flashlight beam, silhouettes seemed to appear, and in the sound of my own footsteps, someone else's echo could be heard. The first material proof that I was on the right track was found in the 7th hour of the descent, in a deep hall that once served as a pumping station. The beam of light slid over a black, oily puddle and snatched a bright spot out of the darkness. It was a plastic camera lens cap with a recognizable logo. It lay on the edge of the puddle, covered with a thin layer of stone dust. My heart beat faster. The discovery confirmed the most terrifying theory. The photographer had indeed ended up here, deep underground, far from the rescue teams. But there was nothing to rejoice about. A whole month had passed. Surviving in such conditions, without food, heat, and most importantly, without light, seemed impossible for human psychology and physiology. The further journey turned into reading a grim trail. A few meters later, I found a torn wrapper from an energy bar. Then a battery, obviously thrown away after it was completely discharged. The tracks indicated that the person was moving blindly, feeling the walls. On sharp stone protrusions, I noticed dark, dried spots, the nature of which I did not want to realize. The direction of movement led deeper, to the abandoned workings of the 3rd level, where even during the mine's operation, conditions were considered unbearable due to the accumulation of gases and groundwater. The descent to the 3rd level was a vertical shaft with the remains of an iron ladder. The steps were rusted through, and every movement was accompanied by a creak and a scattering of rust into the abyss. As I descended, I felt the smell changing. A sharp, nauseating stench of an unwashed body, ammonia, and some kind of animal wildness mixed with the aroma of dampness and dust. My instinct for self-preservation screamed about the need to turn back, but the light of my flashlight had already illuminated the flat floor of the lower tier. The tunnels of the 3rd level were flooded ankle-deep. The water was icy and black as pitch. I waded forward, trying to make as little noise as possible, although it was practically impossible. And then the light snatched something that made me freeze in my tracks. At the end of the tunnel, where the working ended in a blind alley, a primitive barricade of rotten boards and stones had been built. Behind this barricade, in the corner, curled up in a tiny ball, was a creature in which one could only recognize a human being with great difficulty. It was him. His clothes had turned into rags, covered with layers of dirt and dried slime. He was unnaturally thin, his skin tightly stretched over his bones, having acquired a deadly gray, almost transparent tint due to the complete lack of sunlight. His hair was matted into stiff tangles, But the most terrifying thing was not his physical exhaustion. The most terrifying thing was his reaction to the light. When the beam of my flashlight slid over his figure, he did not try to cover his face with his hands or turn away. He slowly raised his head. His eyes were wide open, the pupils dilated to the limit, completely swallowing the iris, turning the eyes into two black, bottomless wells. There was no joy of salvation in these eyes, no surprise, not even fear. There was absolute, ringing emptiness. The mind of a man left alone with primal darkness, silence, and hunger for a whole month could not stand it. It broke, adapting to conditions for which the human brain is not designed. Around him lay the bones of small rodents gnawed to whiteness, the remains of cave mushrooms, and dried roots that had broken through the ceiling. He survived by turning into something else, into a creature of the dungeon. My presence caused only a slight, mechanical twitching of his head. He slowly backed deeper into his corner, pressing into the cold stone, trying to merge with it, to become part of this eternal darkness. Not a single sound escaped from his parched throat. No plea for help, no groan. Only the quiet, barely perceptible scratching of long, broken nails on the granite. The way back merged into one endless, exhausting nightmare. Transporting a person who resists light and open space turned into a test on the verge of human capabilities. I had to build a semblance of a stretcher out of jackets and ropes, dragging him behind me through narrow drifts and flooded tunnels. He did not try to attack me, but his body was limp and heavy, and any exposure to a beam of light on his face caused him a slight, feverish trembling. The ascent up the rusty ladder took several hours of grueling struggle with gravity and fatigue. When we finally reached the narrow breach of the hidden entrance, and I pulled him to the surface, it was deep night outside. But even the dim light of the moon and stars was enough for him to reflexively curl up into a fetal position, covering his head with his hands. I called the rescuers and an ambulance on my satellite phone, sitting next to him on the cold autumn earth. Until the doctors arrived, we sat in complete silence. This story does not have a happy ending in the usual sense. The man was found alive, but what returned from the depths of the mine will never be able to live in a world of sun and sounds. The hospital where he is now located is forced to keep him in a room with tightly drawn curtains and minimal lighting. And I, closing my eyes every night, continued to see those absolutely black, dilated pupils that absorbed all the horror of the abandoned mine, and hear the quiet scratching of nails on stone, reminding me of how fragile human consciousness is in the face of real, ancient darkness.